can see. I wanna go where the lame will walk. I wanna see the sick ones clean, where the deaf can hear and the silent talk. Where are you going? To a ghost dance in the snow. I am a mighty warrior.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Tuesday. I hate holiday weeks because they mess my schedule up. Our garbage day is on Monday, and so we had to make sure the garbage was down for Tuesday. And then the kids started school today, and it's Tuesday. And so the week is already in play. So there really is no Monday. So Monday's been scratched off, even though we did a show last night, and we had a Monday. It was a weird Monday, and I worked all day. So I want to welcome you to the Intrepid radio program. It's me, Scotty Roberts. Good to have you here, folks. I'm glad you're joining us. And we're right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. You know, I wonder about the way we speak. I say we're right here. We're right here on the radio. Well, of course we're right here. I've got to devise, when you do radio and when your face is in public and your words are all in public, you got to find ways to say things so you don't sound, I don't know. You want to be a little bit above average in the way you say things. And so, yes, we're right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, where we'll always be, and we're also over on my YouTube channel, the video version of this, where you can watch my face talk, and sometimes I'll have some cool pictures that I throw up, and you can look at things in my background, like my Starship Enterprise and my statue of Sunanwit back there, my penman hats all hanging here, and my sword collection and my Constitution, things like that. And my right here, my little bunny rabbit with a sword that's got a story with it as well. That goes back to Tam O'Hare days. And so that's the plus of the visuals. And so you can come and join us. And also a plus is there's a live chat room there. So if you want to listen to the audio version over on Odyssey, as well as the radio stations that broadcast to, you can always call up if you're sitting at your computer, or if you've got your phone and a way to watch it. You can call up youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts and catch this live as a live video and join in the live chat room as well. I know we get a lot of people that watch the video that don't join in the chat room. Come on in sometime and add your 2 cents worth. I'm glad you're here either way. So happy Tuesday evening. I hope it's been a good day for you, getting back to work. Some of you, like me, getting kids back to school. It's been a fun day doing that. Leave some open hours without screaming and fighting and wrestling and feeding and all of that stuff. So it's nice to have the kids back in school. Even though there are times we've thought we should homeschool our kids. Now, I know there's a stigma to that. Oh, we generally associate homeschooling with certain evangelical sects or religious right and all of that. I don't think that's across the board anymore. I think a lot of people have decided they want to get their kids out of public education and start doing it at home. It takes less time, but you got to be dedicated to do it, and you got to be at home. Now, my wife, Rainey, she's been a stay-at-home mom for 10 years, and now we've got a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old who is starting pre-kindergarten this week sometime. And so there'll be hours of the day where my wife is absolutely bereft of children. And it's one of those things, if you're a parent, you can't wait till the freedom of having no kids at home comes. But then, if you're like my wife, you can't wait for that, but then you're going to miss them as soon as they're gone all day. So that's the way it goes. That's the way it rolls in my house. So it'll be nice to have my wife and I home. My wife does stuff. She wants to continue doing some of her in-home business stuff. She makes journals. I wish I had one in my hand. They're all over there in her studio. Makes handmade stuff, and she does all kinds of stuff like that. And it'll be fun to see her start to get back into some of that. And as for me, I've just got the same old stuff going. I mean, I do cartooning, I do illustration, I do design, as many of you know. This just happens to be sitting on my desk this morning because I'm doing scans of these, but I'm doing comic book work. I've got this big graphic novel series that I've been working on. And this is the kind of stuff I do day in and day out. I do book illustration work. This was for a book that I did. You can see that illustration there. So this is the kind of stuff I do all day long, every day. Oh, ladies, you might like this. This is for, I say ladies, and maybe there's some guys that'll like this too. But these are some of the characters from this comic book. Some of the character sketches. This is one of the main characters in there. He's an underwater photographer, and he gets drawn into all this stuff. It's a novel that was written by my friend Gareth Worthington. And Gareth is from over in Europe, but he wrote an award-winning, you can't be from Europe and write a good book. He's from Europe, and he has written a fantastic novel, Children of the Fifth Son. And that's not his only novel, but it's an award-winning novel. And he's got me dividing this huge book into 3 graphic novels. And then we're going to compile them all into one. And he's also working on a big movie deal for that, science fiction. So it should be really good. But that's what I do when I'm not doing this. That's the stuff that I do day in and day out. And I might as well give a little plug for my own business. I've been a freelance artist since 2001. And back when, not long after 9/11, if you remember some of the biographical stuff I was talking about myself, autobiographical stuff, in one of the shows, our company that I was with as a creative director went under in 2001, right after 9/11. And we lost a lot of our clients that just didn't feel they wanted to start advertising again right away. And it took about a year and a half for the advertising market to really get back up to snuff after 9/11. And I started freelancing during that time because the agency I was with closed down. And so that's what I've been doing. If any of you need logo design, any kind of design like that, that's what I do. I've been doing that since 1977 when I was 17 years old in high school. And so I've got a pretty good track record. You can go look at my site. It's scrolling underneath this here, by the way. You'll see scottallenroberts.com. Just click on that and go click on my art and design links over there. And you'll see the kind of stuff I do and create. I'm not only a traditional artist and illustrator, pencil, I'm talking watercolor, pen and ink, all of that stuff. I also go digital, and I do a lot of work digitally as far as logo designs and design work and book design and things like that. For those of you who are writers, if you need a good illustrator for your book, kids' book, anything else, I do that. I also do book cover design, and you can go see a lot of my book cover designs over on my website. So there you go. There's a little plug for what I do other than radio. And if you need any work, contact me. Get in touch with me. Love to do your work for you. And so that's what I do in here around doing radio. And I do this radio show, the Intrepid radio show. I also do radio with Rocky Stucci, the Meatball Army over on Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. And I do every now and then something with Jeff Dougherty. We did the Consequential Rapscallions. And I think Jeff has grown so big and has so many different things that he's doing now. That had to get cut from his schedule, so we're not doing that actively anymore. But you can find on my YouTube channel some of our old programs, and they're all stacked up in there. And most everything we do in archive is worth listening to again because it's timely. There's very little that we talk about as far as current events and things like that will take these radio shows out of being relevant. They're always relevant. And so especially the kind of stuff I've been doing here where we're talking about Cain and Abel, and we're talking about is that what I got taught in Sunday school, or what, are the things still true that I was taught in Sunday school? I can't even remember my own title for this. That's not what I was taught in Sunday school. And so these things are relevant. They're good to think about. And I want you to hopefully I'm helping you open up your minds and expand your minds a bit. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of my core listeners, especially over on my YouTube channel, you are all people that know this stuff. You have a handle on the fact that things aren't exactly what we were taught they were, and that there's more to it. The more I was thinking today, I was driving my kids to school, and on the way back I have, about 15 minutes of free time in the car, and I was just thinking about all the things that I once believed by faith, and how now, after looking at them deeper and trying to dig beneath the surface and know more about it, how much it sounds like mythology. It's just even Christianity and Western culture, which kind of views itself as being, well, most religions do this. They believe that they're the right way to believe, the right way to do things, the right way to reach God, the right way to understand our beginnings, our origins. And yet when you start even reading the biblical stories, you will find that they read many times like mythology. And we read through the Genesis account in this little series a few days ago, and how much that sounds like mythology. So, does that mean it's true? And that all mythology is true? Or does it mean, like my old seminary professor, Dr. Charles Ailing, once told me, which again, I'll state this again, when he told me it was brand new, back 35 years ago. Now it's old hat to say something like this, but he told me, he said, all mythology has at its headwaters a kernel of truth. And that's true about all of this stuff. So the big question is, what's true? What really happened? And if you can take even the mythology, as I talk about these biblical mythologies and these biblical stories, all of this stuff has a kernel of truth somewhere in it. There was some proto-religion somewhere. It's either somebody made all this shit up and everybody ran off with their own version of it, or there are real events at the core. Now, talking about creation and the creation's first family, like Adam and Eve, like Wazazu and Watanka, I can't remember their names exactly. Lakota being one reference. All these different creation stories that exist out there. They all have their stories and their beginnings, but if you melt them all down, they all kind of tell a very similar story of what happened at creation, with very few examples that stray from that basic story. And so I'm looking at this from a biblical perspective, and I'm getting into this, and I think we're going to wrap this one up today. That's not what they taught me in Sunday school, even though that's going to be a theme we might follow for many, many years to come. With all we're doing, we're going to wrap this particular series up. I've talked about this stuff many, many times. And because of my books, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, The Secret History of the Reptilians, even in a certain sense, The Exodus Reality, those are all books that really reflect this thinking on origins, on Western Christian tradition, and things like that, and how it has changed, how it's morphed. I remember I've said many times, I used to sit, I know during the writing of one of my books, it might have been in between the two, and I was starting to write The Secret History of the Reptilians, and I would sit after I would soak in some of this information and read it, and I would sit in my chair leaning back, and it'd be like 2 in the morning because I'd been up writing all day, and I'd look at the ceiling and the ceiling fan turning, and I'd slowly turn in my chair without making myself motion sick, which happens now that I'm a little older. And, think of that for just a second. I used to ride, when I was a teenager, roller coaster. We go to the amusement park, roller coaster, 15 times in a row. The roundup, 100 times in a row. We do all these things, and it never affected me. Now that I'm old, all I have to do is look at a Ferris wheel, and I get queasy. So I was sitting in my chair, and I thought, what if all this stuff isn't real? What if all this stuff I was taught isn't real anymore? Because it sounds so much like the other things. And then I would see, even in practice, I remember this is when it hit me once. I was reading a news article several years ago about Islam in America. And they were talking about how the kids in this publicly funded Islamic school were being taught Islamic religion. And I thought, well, the people were complaining because, well, why do they get to teach religion and we can't have prayer in public school? There's always these caveats that exist, and there are exceptions made. And so I was wondering about that as I was reading that. And I saw some videos where they were training the children in school to quote Islamic verses, to quote verses from the Quran. And that was part of their education as Muslims. And so I thought, as I was listening to the kids reciting verses, I thought, this is no different than what I heard in church. Take the school element out of it. Youth group and Sunday school and all of these things. We used to have a group, and I think it still exists, in the evangelical churches called Awana. I don't even remember what it stood for, but it was kind of supposed to be the Christian church's alternative to Cub Scouts and things like that. Let's not have Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. Let's have Awana, because there were the little uniforms, little gray thing with the red scarf, and you could win awards, but you won awards many times by learning Bible verses and quoting them back. And you'd win awards for certain amounts and how many Bible chapters you read, all that kind of stuff, all geared around faith issues. And then I remember thinking, oh, these Islamists, these Muslims, they're all teaching their kids these verses. No wonder and I stopped and go, wait a minute, that's exactly what we do in the Christian church. And this is where I think it started to dawn on me. Even though it's such an obvious thing to see out there, it started dawning on me that Western culture, Christianity, is no different than the other religions out there. We all do the same things. We all teach our kids certain things. We all teach our kids the Bible verses and so on and things like that, especially if you're a regular church attendee and member of an evangelical church. That's what we did. And I said, there's no difference between practice. And so when you start digging deeper, you find there's no difference between even the forming of some of these religions, the faith mandates, the tenets of the faith are all based in what people wrote about them. And then it became very hard to continue to accept that the Bible was God's only word to man. And I started asking, which God? Now, there's still a bit of me that says, I don't believe in Allah. I don't believe He is God. But I have my reasons for that. And then I start to wonder about Jehovah God, the God that we worship in church, Jesus Christ being raised to divine status. I would start questioning all of those because I found that in studying for one of my books, I wrote about how Muhammad encoded or formulated Islam, and how that he had a Christian man who was a mentor of his, and also a Jewish man who was a mentor. And he was really plagued with the question, how do I unify the Arabic clans in his day? And we're talking like 1,300, 1,400 years ago. And he was told by his mentors, first thing you got to do is capture them with religion. You've got to go monotheistic, because in Mecca, there were over 290 gods that were worshipped. And so what did Muhammad do? And without going through all the strictures of and the history of how he accomplished this, it was not an overnight process. But he eliminated, like 289 of these gods to lower status, demons, angels, devils, things like sub-gods, minor gods. But he elevated the chief god, one god, I think his name was Hamad, he elevated him to chief god status and renamed him Allah. And he says, Allah shall be our one monotheistic God. So in a sense, he created Islam out of whole cloth. No offense to my Islamic listeners and to my Islamic friends, but this is just the history. And so Moses did the same thing when he codified Judaism. He created Judaism out of whole cloth, but bits and pieces of everything else around him in his day. Egyptian religion, Mesopotamian religion. Only he combined them all and he created his own code. He created his own law. And this became Judaism. Christianity rose out of Judaism. The issue of the coming Messiah, the kinsman redeemer, the one who would be one of us, redeemer. It all came out of these verses that we're looking at now and carried through the whole Old Testament. And as we already demonstrated, all the things that happened in the first messianic prophecy in the Garden of Eden when God is cursing the serpent, God is cursing the woman and the man. And there's the first messianic prophecy is buried in there. Then the rest of the Old Testament, it shows all these genealogies throughout the Old Testament, all these things written to show that the Messiah, the kinsman redeemer, the redeemer of mankind, the Savior, the Christ in Greek, would all come from this line of pure human bloodlines. Now, I was called a racism for saying that once and writing about that there was a pure human bloodline. Oh, you're a racist! I was told in some big article some guy wrote. And he called me out on that. Called me out, quote unquote. Well, I said, remember, my response was to him, you're talking about biblical mythology, and you're talking about celestial beings coming down and impregnating human women, and that their offspring was the non-human bloodline, the non-pure human bloodline. They were kind of halfsies. And so the Messiah had to come not from that line, but from the line that descended from Adam, through Seth, because Cain was of that mixed bloodline, the son of the serpent, Nakash. Not a real serpent, by the way. And so I know we're closing in already, believe it or not, on the end of this first segment. Got about another minute left. But this is, in the second part, I want to try to wrap this series up. I spent a little too much time talking about my artwork and stuff like that. So you can go visit my site and see all that. I'll try not to spend any more time on that. But this topic is something, why did there need to be a trace that followed the human bloodline back to Adam? Why such a meticulous biblical record? And I want to make this statement before we go out to break. And this kind of, even though I had studied and researched and written the books, I was on Coast to Coast once a few years ago talking about this book, and I said, and George said, well, Scott, what is the, we were toward the end of the show, what's the main thrust of this book? And I said, it's to realize that the story of creation in the Bible is not just a story of creation, it's a story of race interrupted. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we come back. 2 minutes from now, you sit tight, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back.
Set free, you will need the witch's cabin key. Find the lady of the light, gone mad with the night. That's how you reach your destiny. And now to see your love set free, you will need the witch's cabin key. The light still raving in the night. That's how you reach your destiny.
Live in simultaneous broadcast from a hidden cornfield in Wisconsin, and some time-forgotten holy of holies. Intrepid Radio with Scotty Roberts' Intelligent Talk.
All right, folks. Thanks for coming back. It's segment 2 of the Intrepid Radio program with me, your host, Scotty Roberts. You can also watch this live over on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, all spelled out. And you can join the live chat room there, even while you listen to the audio on odyssey1.com, ODYSY1.com. Now, we were talking about this. Why was there a need in the Old Testament to trace the genealogy of humanity? It's because in the Garden of Eden, it spoke about there being a need for a Savior, a need for a Messiah. It was prophesying that one would come. Both in, you look that up, that verse that says where God is saying to the serpent and to the woman, and there will be constant enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Constant enemies going on. And it started with Cain and Abel. That enemyship, that the stuff that, and I said I would talk about the human sacrifice aspect of that. Again, I didn't prepare for that today with material other than to restate to you that Cain murdered Abel. And it probably wasn't for the surface story. It's probably because Abel was bringing the first fruits. He was bringing the blood sacrifices. And so this whole thing of Moloch, which came out later after the flood, the descendants of Noah, and a few generations down you had Nimrod, the king, who built the Tower of Babel. It is said that they worshipped to the god Moloch, a big statue of this god, a brazen god, that they would heat up to white hot. And they would throw the babies inside to sacrifice to the god. Human sacrifice isn't anything new. And Moloch eventually became known also as Baal. Remember in Israel, maybe you don't remember this, after the Exodus, when Israel established itself as a nation, excuse me, there was the worship of Baal and Asherah in the land. And even the kings, God would many times through the prophets condemn the kings of Israel who allowed there to be Baal worship and Asherah worship. They had the Asherah poles, which were really just big phallic symbols when you look at them. There are some that still exist today. But this Baal worship was Moloch worship, which took place right after the flood and probably as early as Abel. But who was he sacrificing? Who were the humans? Because I've constantly said there were only 4 people, Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Who was he sacrificing? Well, remember, we talked about Cain and the other people. I don't believe they were the only 4 on the planet. They were the only 4 in Hebrew theology, though. Jewish theology. And so he was sacrificing. Cain killed him for this. And God marked Cain so nobody would kill him for killing his brother. There's a whole deeper thing to dig into on this, which I'm not doing today. But other than to mention it. And so Cain was the son of Nakash, the serpent seed doctrine. The serpent character in the Old Testament was Nakash, who I believe by his description, the bright shining one, the bringer of knowledge, was one of the Elohim, who in Psalm 82 you find that Elohim speaks to the group of Elohim, calls them all Elohim and the bright shining princes of heaven. So I believe that these are correlated. They're together. They're the same thing. So the serpent in the garden, Nakash, was one of the Elohim, and that he fathered Cain, while Adam fathered Abel, the fraternal twins who were fathered by different dads. And then, of course, you find the genealogies when they start. They don't go back to Cain, who was the firstborn of the twins, so the older brother by a few minutes, probably. They don't go back to him. Why do they not go back to Cain? In tradition, all of these genealogies go through the firstborn son, all the way through the lineage, down through the Old Testament. There's a chapter after chapter. But why, when they came all the way back to tracing it back to Adam, did they skip Cain? They skipped Abel, probably because he didn't have any kids. They skipped Cain Because Cain was not fully human. The kinsman redeemer, the one who would be one of us redeemer, could not come from the bloodlines of somebody like Cain, because he was half Elohim, half human. And so what did they do in the lineage? They go back through the third born child of Adam and Eve, Seth. Now he's the oldest son. And so they go through Seth. They skip Cain. It's a big, obvious elephant in the room that never really gets talked about. You hear, when you do hear it talked about in Christian theology, it's because Cain murdered his brother, so he's out. Well, that doesn't take away his birthright. That doesn't mean he's not the firstborn son. They skipped him because he was not pure human. And so when you see all through the Old Testament, the Messiah, the kinsman redeemer as he was known, needed to come from the bloodline of Adam. They keep saying this over and over again. It obviates the opposite, that there was something that was not the pure bloodline of Adam. And so this was this record of genealogies. It was to show this flow of humanity from the first human man. It was to establish this traceable lineage of the coming Messiah, the kinsman redeemer, prophesied during the pronouncement of cursing and judgment back in Genesis 3, verse 15. And these genealogical records exist for one purpose and one purpose only. And that in the Old Testament. And that is to establish that there existed a dual bloodline in humanity. Bequeathed in the Garden of Eden, the seed of Adam being the pure human bloodline, the seed of Nakash being the bloodline of the mixed human and Elohim blood, as bred into Eve. And as I noted earlier, the First Chronicles passage, the book of First Chronicles, the firstborn son Cain, as well as the younger twin, whom he murdered, are both omitted from the genealogy. Why? Why were they taken out? Cain is the firstborn, and by Hebrew tradition, Israelite tradition, he should have appeared in the list immediately following Adam, but he's omitted from the genealogical record as listed in the Old Testament for the simple reason that he was not pure human. Cain was of the mixed blood of Nakash and Eve. And he was the first of the, if you will, the Nephilim, the descendants of the celestial mixing. And Abel wasn't listed in the record for the simple fact that he was murdered by Cain before he'd bequeathed any children. So he didn't have a line to follow. That's why we see the third-born son Seth listed in the genealogical record as the direct descendant of Adam. That gets into the traceable line that goes up to Abraham, to Noah, then from Noah to Abraham to King David. So all of these things. And so if you recall, this is extremely important to understand the entirety of the Old Testament. Cain as the firstborn son of Eve, fathered by an Elohim, by Nakash, the serpent character in the Garden of Eden. He was the bright shining princes of heaven, one of the bright shining princes of heaven. And he represents the mixed bloodline. And if the Messiah was to be the kinsman redeemer, the savior of mankind, born of mankind, his lineage had to be established as being from the pure human bloodline. Therefore, a descendant of Seth, not of Cain. All right? So, to me, I think that that's interesting stuff. You can't go around it. You can't avoid it. Let's talk about this kinsman redeemer. What the hell did that mean? What is a kinsman redeemer? The ancient Hebrew sense of redemption was firmly fixed in the word goel, the act of redeeming a kinsman. The Hebrew sensibility understood the Messiah to be the kinsman redeemer, the one who would come to save, redeem, rectify, but was also a near kin to the family. So why did the Savior of God need to be human? Why did he need to be one of us? The concept was structured like this. Provision was made in the law of Moses for the person who was forced to sell part of his property or himself into slavery. His nearest of kin could step in and buy back what his relative was forced to sell. The kinsman redeemer, the one of the family redeemer, was usually a rich benefactor, or a person who frees the debtor from paying the ransom price. And you'll find this in the Levitical law of Moses. Leviticus 25:25. It says, if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor that he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. That was the redeemer, the one who would rectify things, the kinsman redeemer. It was referred to, and that's the principle that was established. Now, the nearest kin had the responsibility of redeeming his kinsman's lost opportunities. If a person was forced into bankruptcy, into slavery because of it, that's the way they did things back then. And you think we don't have slavery now? Just called something different. It's the tax code and things like that. His redeemer purchased his freedom. And when debt threatened to overwhelm him, the kinsman stepped in to redeem his homestead and let the family live. If a family member died without an heir, the kinsman redeemer gave his name by marrying the widow. This is why you saw the old tradition of guys who would have to marry their brother's wives. In order, if their brother died, they would marry the brother's wife. There was a tradition. It even went up into colonial American times. And maybe even it's still practiced a little bit now today, just not a legal tradition. And when death came at the hands of another man, the Redeemer acted as the avenger of blood and pursued the killer. And this you find in the book of Numbers, chapter 35, and Deuteronomy, chapter 19. So when you think of the Jewish Messiah, the Christ in the Greek, remember that their concept of Messiah came from this concept of the kinsman redeemer, the one who was from among us, one of the family members, coming to save or redeem us. And while this is a high, mighty, biblical concept of redemption and salvation, it's also the theology in which was buried the encoded message of race interrupted and a dual human bloodline. You see how that works? It couldn't be somebody from the outside of human blood that could be the kinsman redeemer to humanity. It had to be somebody who was human. That's why you have God coming in the form of a man, the New Testament theology that picked that up and defined it a little better in Christianity, a more honed. This piggybacked on the prophecies of the coming Messiah, whose heritage was said over and over and over again, all throughout the Old Testament, to be that of a kinsman who would be of pure human blood, of pure family blood. This was the story of a pure-blooded race versus a mixed-blooded race. And this is where, don't get caught up in the whole racism, political correctness nonsense talk. We're not talking about whites versus blacks or people of color versus people who are Caucasian. It has nothing to do with that. We're talking about pure human blood when it came to the kinsman redeemer for the salvation of mankind. Somebody who was one of us could not be mixed with the tainted blood of the Elohim, which, by the way, the whole story of the Nephilim, the Elohim coming down, mixing with human women, it was all the preamble to the flood and the wickedness brought to mankind, which is what we were taught in Sunday school. Why did God bring the flood? Because of the wickedness of mankind. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and he was pure and righteous and pure in all his generations, is the key phrase there. Noah was chosen because he was of pure human blood, not the mixed blood of the Elohim human mix, which was the wickedness brought to mankind. The wickedness of mankind was not because they would swear and they would beat each other and they'd go drinking, or they would rape, or they would commit crimes of murder or thievery. That's not the wickedness of mankind being spoken of in the Noah and the Ark passage. The wickedness of mankind is the tainting of the human blood. the wickedness brought to us, the wickedness that was done by these 200 prefects, these watchers, the Elohim who descended to Mount Hermon and went down amongst the women of the human race and had children by them. And they spread that, and then God was wiping that out. Now, this is not singled out just in the Noah story. This is in almost every culture that has a flood story. There was also the tainting of the human blood and the divine presence wanting to wipe that out. So, for when the very first prophecy of the kinsman redeemer was uttered directly after the impregnation of Eve by both Adam and Nakash, dovetailing with the proclamation that there would forever be a state of conflict between the seed of Nakash and the seed of the woman, the mixed race and the pure race, there was a necessity to provide a traceable heritage from which the future prophesied Messiah would be able to hail. This is why you have the genealogies all through the Old Testament, to set up the bloodline. When we read those when we were kids, this is the most boring part of the Bible. And it is boring, some of these books, just to read 13 chapters of genealogies of so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and had 7 sons, and his son lay with 2 women and begat so-and-so as his firstborn. You read that for 13 chapters, your eyes gloss over. But the necessity of it in Hebrew culture, Israelite culture, was to establish that there was a pure human bloodline to trace the lineage of the Messiah all the way back to Adam. Now, here's the big question. If there were only humans, and only pure-blooded humans on the planet, why would you even have to establish that? Because any person born would obviously be a product of the lineage of Adam and Eve. Except there was a race interrupted. There was a side branch, if you will, or an equal side branch of the mixed blood. So in short, the Old Testament story of the Messiah and the corresponding genealogical records substantiating this traceable, pure human bloodline obviates the complete opposite, that there was an impure bloodline, one from which the kinsman redeemer could not come because he was not full-blooded kin. He could not rectify from a status of being full-blooded human, being full-blooded relatives, so to speak. And that was the bloodline of Nakash, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, a member of the divine council, one of the gods of the pantheon of gods, known as the sons of God, the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the watchers, they were also known as. I've just got to state emphatically here that the story and the prophecies of the Messiah, woven throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, were there for one reason: to provide an encoded, deeply subtextual message speaking to common events that every other ancient religion wrote about. The story of a coming Messiah seems more and more to simply be the Hebrew religion's collective anthology and mythology that needed to establish a pure human bloodline, in opposition to the race interrupted, the dubious origins, as there's simply no way to establish any sort of solid fact in this. We just go back to the biblical scripture and we see that you can't establish this in a laboratory. There's no scientific methodology with this. What this is looking at the biblical mythology and saying this is how it makes sense. So there's a sort of ad hoc scientific mythology by going through and examining all of this and seeing how it all took place. So that, to me, is the most important feature in dissecting these old stories we were taught about as kids in Sunday school, and that we carried, if you're of Western Christian mentality, all the way into our adult faith and things we don't even think about anymore. So it really boils down to race interrupted. What does that tell you? From the very get-go, Adam and Eve in the garden, this whole idea of extraterrestrial meddling with the bloodline of humanity, and by extraterrestrial, we've aligned that with aliens. Maybe the aliens are linked to all of this mythology, but what I mean by that, extraterrestrial, not of this earth. If you are divine, if you're celestial, if you're from the divine celestial, Mount Olympus, heaven, whatever you want to call it, that's all extraterrestrial, not of this earth. Mixing the bloodline, tampering with the bloodline, which you see with the Anunnaki culture, where Enlil said to Enki, create for us primordial man to do our bidding. And so there was tampering with the bloodlines. That's kind of when you think about it, kind of mind-boggling. It is to me, to think that this whole thing that we place in the category of fantasy or science fiction or weird conspiracy type system might all be the same thing you are reading in biblical stories that are encoded messages. So, comparatively speaking, we've only got a few minutes left here. The symbolic tree of knowledge of good and evil, as depicted in the Genesis account of Eden, the object of forbidden fruit, consumed by the first couple, inciting God's wrath and judgment, is the Hebrew correspondent to the very same palm tree in Eden, depicted as having a trunk around which a half-man, half-snake is entwined. It's from this tree that Enki Ea passed on knowledge and intelligence to humans. Or in the parallel Genesis scenario, Nakosh taught the first human couple to partake of forbidden knowledge, sexual behavior. As the information was absorbed by Eve and passed on to Adam, their perceptions and awareness of reality quickly shifted, leaving the two in a severe state of shock and fear. Note that a person who is totally unaware of the reality in which they live are said to reside in an Edenic state. That's a psychological term, an Edenic state. The account goes on to explain that soon thereafter the couple ran and hid themselves from the voice of God, not because they had their first sexual experiences, nor that they were shy of their nakedness, even though Adam said they were hiding because they were naked. It's because they were suddenly appallingly aware that there was a profound physical difference between the gods and themselves. They were experiencing an enlightenment, for good or ill, that they had not known prior to these events. And it's clear that until this time, the humans had no concept that they were in any way physically different from their divine counterparts. And they had finally leapt from their childlike innocence and ignorance into the realization that they were intended by design to be tillers of the field, slaves to their overlords. And there was also this fear, as it was accounted in Genesis, that they had as slaves who transgressed the law brought down upon themselves the enormity of the divinity's consequence. And so this whole symbolism of the forbidden tree in Eden is not limited to Judeo-Christianity. The Eastern god Krishna sat atop a coiled serpent beneath the branches of the banyan tree, and from there bestowed spiritual knowledge to mankind. Further representations of the tree can be found in many crucifixion accounts of great teachers and gods, such as that of Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent god of the Toltec and the Aztec civilizations, whose crucifixion on a tree is etched forever in stone in that culture. The wooden crucifixes upon which those that bestowed knowledge upon humankind, the symbols of supreme gods, called the Egyptian Tau and Ankh, represent the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It was the result of teaching the forbidden knowledges to humans that those divinities, those personages, were killed, executed. And the remarkable fact is that throughout all ancient and modern civilizations, the serpent or the dragon bestowing knowledge upon the human race figures prominently throughout all cultures, all histories. The Judeo-Christian serpent is embodied in the fallen angel that eventually became known as Lucifer. The Mayan serpent god Quetzalcoatl, the enormous plumed serpent god of the Hopi Indians, the Balinkangoga, the mystical human-like reptilians known as the Naga of India, the Egyptian serpent god Neph, The Phoenicians, Agathodemon. Agathodemon. I don't know how to... I don't know where the emphasis falls on that. Agathodemon. And even the Hebrews, Nehushtan, the bronze serpent raised on the pole by Moses for healing. The brazen serpent that Moses raised on the pole for the people to be healed was the same word as Nakosh, the Nehushtan. But these are only a few of the myriad accounts that exist in these worldwide religious cultures, describing early gods as having this influence on human physical features, as well as having descended from celestial places. And so there's a little bit more to wrap this up. Maybe we'll hit it tomorrow, but we're at the end of our time. I may have even run over time. I don't know. So at least for the radio audience. So folks, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope this stuff makes some impact. Look into it. Read this stuff. Find out more about it. Don't let anyone tell you what to believe. Make up your own mind. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time. Good night.
Got too close to the flame, calling out, Father, oh, hold fast and we will watch the flames burn open on the mountainside. Desolation comes upon the sky, and I see fire inside the mountain. I see fire burning the trees, and I see fire hollow in soul. I see fire.